Thing. So good evening, everybody, and welcome. My name is Bob Bruner. I am the A&R Extension Educator with Purdue University. I'm based in Clay and Owen counties. And like I said just a moment ago, I'm an entomologist and I have been a pond ecologist for quite some time now. So I've had a lot of opportunity to work with the organisms that we're going to be talking about mostly this evening. Now, like it says on the slide in front of you, tonight we're talking about aquatic macroinvertebrates and other critters. So macroinvertebrates is a general term that usually is applied to aquatic insects who are going to make up the lion's share of what people think of when you say the word macroinvertebrate. However, there are other organisms that fit under that. We're going to talk about at least one of those. Now, just a little bit of preface for this one. What we are going to be going over this evening are organisms that are considered good bioindicators or considered not harmful to human beings. There are a lot more that we can discuss, such as mosquitoes and other things, but tonight I wanted to go over those things you can look for that will tell you if your pond's ecosystem is healthy and what their place in that ecosystem is going to be. But if you have questions on things that are not mentioned here this evening, please feel free to ask them. I am more than happy to go over them with all of you. But why don't we go ahead and dive in? All right, so one of the things that people often ask me is, why do we even care about these things? They're tiny, they're often kind of gross to us. Why do we care? Well, first we have to understand that when it comes to the balance of life in a pond, it's actually a very, very delicate balance. There needs to be the right amount of heat, the right amount of oxygen and sunlight that's going to allow different kinds of life to be able to thrive. Even if you just want your pond for fishing, those fish need food. They need other processes to happen to be able to survive. And a lot of our pond macroinvertebrates are going to be responsible for making those processes work. But the simplest one, the one that's most easily understood, is just the fact that these guys are a food source, and they're a very, very necessary food source for a lot of our fish and other organisms that we're going to put value behind. If you like a pond that has a lot of frogs visiting it, you need a pond that has insects in it, or other critters like crayfish and other things that are going to help keep that wheel of life turning. So like I mentioned, why do we care? Well, I just gave you a reason. We care because these insects are our food, but they're not just our food. They're also how our pond stays clean. They're how our oxygen rolls through the water. They're the things that keep all those processes moving. I had a professor once who made the rather bold statement that if all insects disappeared off of the face of Earth, the planet would die within a few weeks because so many vital things just suddenly stopped. And he probably wasn't very far wrong. I'm sure he was absolutely correct. And it's certainly true within a pond environment. The minute you have insects leave a pond environment, the water essentially goes dead and you get things that you don't want. So some of the things that they also do, in addition to acting as a food source, in addition to just keeping some of those biological processes going, they also help manage our aquatic plants. Now, we really appreciate this because that means that our weed amount in our pond, our weed populations, are going to help be controlled by different insects who may be consuming those plants. These insects are going to act as filter feeders, which are going to filter out microscopic algae and other things out of the water to help keep the water a little cleaner and keep it more livable. They're going to also act as food for other species that we might be interested in. Our frogs, our tadpoles, for some of those few tadpoles that are predatory, our birds, other animals that are going to use them. So insects have a lot of uses when it comes to where they sit within a pond environment. Now, as we move along here, what I want to do is I want to talk to you about three very important insect orders when it comes to ponds. And some of you are probably aware of the orders that I'm going to start with. So whenever you hear pond management specialists, people who work in this kind of environment, we talk about three letters, E, P, and T. And this stands for our insect orders, Ephemeroptera, Plecoptera, and Trichoptera. Now, for those of you who aren't aware what that is, we refer to insect orders, us entomologists. It is a classification of animals It's applied to all kinds of life. It's just insects. We typically refer to their order because we group them together by body morphology and function, and we group them together in these orders. Now, the three that I just mentioned here, you'll recognize at least a few of them pretty readily, starting with our first one. So we're going to start with order Ephemeroptera. Now, for those of you who aren't sure what you are looking at, you are looking at a mayfly. This order contains all of our mayflies, thus the name. Ephemera meaning very, very short-lived, and optera meaning winged. In this case, we're talking about the very short-lived mayfly, which don't quite live for a day. They can sometimes live a couple, but a day is not a bad guess at that one. So we know them really, really well because they only live as adults for a very short amount of time, barely a day in some cases, maybe a little longer. For those of you who have been fishing in places like Minnesota and Wisconsin, you may be familiar with the infamous mayfly hatches, where all of the adults hatch into their adult form out of the water at the same time. They can hatch out so thick that they can quite literally darken the sun. They will cover streets. It's pretty awful when you see it. But I will spare you guys the pictures of that this evening. Now, the thing about mayflies is that they're going to spend the entirety of their immature life underwater. And we're going to refer to them sometimes as naiads or nymphs. Most modern entomologists are going to refer to these as nymphs. They have a life cycle that is considered an incomplete metamorphosis, where the immature will vaguely resemble the adults, though that is just barely true in this particular order. And like a lot of the other insects that we're going to be talking about tonight, the mayfly is a major fly fishing lure. We design our lures around their body types, and a lot of the funny fuzzy lures you see that look like they have kind of bulging eyes on, those are often based on mayflies and dragonfly larvae and things like that. Mayflies are just one of many there. So this picture right here is a great example of what a mayfly larva looks like. Specifically, I believe this one comes from family Ephemeridae. This is a burrowing mayfly. You can see it's got really, really strong kind of forward-facing horns on it to help it move soil and other things. And you can also tell it's a mayfly larva because if you look at the very end of the abdomen, you could see it has these three caudal filaments coming off of it. They're kind of broken in this image, but you can still see that there are three of them there. And one of the important things that I also want to point out to you is if you look along the sides of the abdomen, where all those segments are, you can see funny looking feathery things coming off of it. Well, those feathery things you see there are the gills of the mayfly. These are gill breathing animals, just like fish will. They need water to pass over those surfaces, and that surface will take in dissolved oxygen out of the water. This also gives you an idea of how important it is that this animal has very, very clean water, because its gills are just exposed to the world on the sides of its body. So it's going to be extremely sensitive to pollutants, to temperature changes, sediment, anything that's going to disrupt the natural environment that they're supposed to be in. They're very sensitive to change. This is why we use this particular order as a great bioindicator. They're going to be very sensitive to major changes or even slight changes in the water conditions. They're going to be very informative if something happens where we need to see what's going on and we need to understand it very quickly. Now, as a species, mayfly larvae, in their larval stage, I should say, are filter feeders. They are not predatory or really herbivorous. They're just going to filter things out of the water with their mouth parts. And when they eventually hatch out into adults, they're going to be non-feeding. That's why the adults don't live very long. Their only purpose is to live long enough to find a mate, lay eggs, and then die, which is why you see so many of them dying on the surface of the water. There are going to be several families within Indiana, many of which have different traits to identify them. And I've listed a few of them here, like Betidae, Ephemeridae, Heptageniidae. There are several more families of mayflies. Now, one of the reasons that I'm not showing you those families is because this is where you get into that expert area. This is where you need someone who's been doing this for several years to be confident in their identification. And I've been doing entomology for some time now, and I still struggle a little bit with mayflies that aren't immediately obvious to me. So I'm going to spare you guys that one. I'm just showing you the burrowing mayfly here because I think it's a great example. It's very clean, it's very obvious. You know what you're looking at here. What you can take home with you is that if you're trying to identify this funny larva out of the water, look at the number of little filaments coming off of the abdomen. In this case, the mayfly has 3 of them, and that will stay very, very true. Sometimes they'll break, but if you see 3 of those, you know you've got a mayfly larva. So if we keep moving on to our next group of insects we're going to talk about, let's talk about the P in the EPT that I mentioned. In this case, we are referring to stoneflies or order Plecoptera. Stoneflies are another one that are great for being to inform us on the condition of the environment. They're very, very sensitive, just like our mayflies are. They also have a few unique traits to them. So this is one of the few groups of insects that you will see that will actually emerge in the winter and early spring. They will actually come right out of the water on snow, and I believe they'll also mate as soon as they do so. So they are getting a very early start to things. And it's highly unusual to see insects come out in temperatures that cold. Now, these insects are generally poor flyers, so they're going to stay really close to their natal stream. So if you have stoneflies, that means that you're lucky you have a population there. That population may not be moving very far from that location. So they're going to stay real close. They're going to be sensitive to those temperature changes, to those pollutants. That's why whenever we see those in the water, we say, hey, that's a great sign. Here's what we're looking for specifically in the water. Now you can see there's a real obvious difference there between this one and the mayfly larva. In this case, if we look towards its head, you can actually see 2 of its mouth parts, its mandibles right there that look kind of sharp. And then in terms of gills, the gills are a little less obvious. But where you see those feathery bits coming off in between body segments, those are the gill surfaces on the stonefly. And in this case, it only has 2 caudal filaments coming off the end of the abdomen. I also generally find that stonefly larvae are larger, they're kind of beefier than mayflies are, but they're going to serve essentially the same purpose. They're going to be that great informant as to what's going on in that environment. If I see stonefly larvae in the water, like if I pick up a rock out of a creek or a nice pond bed and I see stoneflies on it, that's going to tell me that I am in a really, really healthy ecosystem and that these stoneflies are a great indicator. So they will live in the water for up to 4 years. So consider that for a moment. Most adults that we've been talking about only live for a very short amount of time. But we could see that stonefly nymphs will live in the water for nearly 4 years. That's a huge amount of time by comparison. Even our normal terrestrial insects that we see only live for at most 1 to 2 years, with a few exceptions here and there. So that's a really fascinating piece of information that tells you how stable their environment is and how capably adapted they are to it. But the adults, of course, like I said, only live for a few days to reproduce. And then we can use those obvious tails that we see coming off the abdomen that are referred to as cerci in this case. Now, our last group in our EPT that we're going to talk about tonight is our Trichoptera. These are our caddisflies. And what you're looking at here is a caddisfly adult. Now, I will be very, very clear with all of you. It is nigh on impossible to identify caddisfly adults down to species, sometimes even down to family. This is because their diagnostic characteristics are very, very particular. And you need someone who has been trained and has a lot of experience paging through all the books on this information and looking through lots and lots of voucher specimens. I learned how to identify them from a professor out in Iowa who's been doing this work for 30 plus years, and I still can barely do it. You're going to find people who've been working in pond environments who are much more capable than I am. So what I want to do is, well, you could see the adult here. The adult's going to look a lot like a moth you might see. What I want to do is I want to show you the larva and inform you a little bit more about what the larvae are going to do. Now, like I said, these things are going to be virtually indistinguishable from moths. You're going to see them flying around, and unless you know what you're looking for, you're going to think it's just another moth flying through the air. And I already mentioned the challenges involved with the adult identification. Now, like our other insects that we talked about, these adults are non-feeding. However, the larva can actually occupy several different food guilds, meaning they can either be predators or herbivores, filter feeders, you name it. In this case, this is what we're talking about when we're talking about our caddisflies. What I'm showing you here is a case-making caddisfly. Now, if I took it out of its case that it's carrying along on its back, it's going to look a lot like any other caterpillar that you see. It's going to be kind of brown, not really be able to describe it very well. But many of them are case making. They'll take pine needles, stones off of the stream bed, any kind of plant material they can get their hands on, and they're going to spin silk out of their mouth parts and put together this case. And they'll just carry it around. It'll help protect them against the environment. They'll channel water across their own gill surfaces that are hidden under there so they can breathe. But they can be predatory. They can shred plants and consume that. They can be decomposers who will clean up the environment down there of dead things. So they're actually pretty broadly adapted to the different kinds of environments they're going to be living in. The hard part is just telling the adults apart from each other. So if you're able to figure out what trichoptera adults look like, more power to you. What I like to do is I like to look in the water and see if I see these guys crawling around throughout the spring and the summer. And if I do, to me, that's a really good indicator. That means that this is a good, healthy, flowing stream. It's not too fast, it's not too slow, and it's got very healthy environment for them. Now, a little bit more on them. So I mentioned that they're case making. They can also create retreats that they will hide in the case of, say, they're an ambush predator or something like that. Or they can even just be a wanderer who forages through whatever they find. And this is probably going to be most of your herbivores and your decomposers. And I mentioned all that that's already listed there. And of course, that they create silk and they can put this together. So they bear a lot of similarities to other kinds of caterpillars that like moths that are able to make silk. All right, so I wanted to go over a few more insect orders that you guys might find interesting as you're doing your work. Some of them are a little unusual. There are several that I just couldn't add in, so I'm going to go through the ones that I was able to, just in the interest of time. So one that I've had the opportunity to do a lot of research on is one known as a back swimmer or nodonectid. They are rather unique in the aquatic world because they swim upside down. If you look down into the water, you will see that their belly, their ventral side, is facing up towards you. This is, in this case, the camera is pointing at the surface of the water. Now, these are predatory insects. They are related to things like aphids or wheel bugs. They're part of that same overall order. However, they are unique in that these guys are aquatic. They'll swim with their large back legs that you saw here in this image. That V shape that its legs are making are how it paddles. It will push those back and propel itself forward. There's a long fringe of hair along each segment of their legs to help them swim. They are definitely predators. They will prey on a lot of different food items. They can take things as large as tadpoles, even some fish. That gives you an idea of how capable a predator these insects are. They will disperse very readily and move between water sources very readily if they detect fish predators. So if you typically get back swimmers and you see them disperse, that's going to give you a really good idea that many of them may have detected a predator, or maybe their food source has run out. So not only can you use E, P, and T to help you figure out what's going on in water, you can also use these other species too, because our predators are going to be reliant on their food sources. And if those sources disappear, then so will they. So another one of note that I bet a lot of you have seen is a water strider. This is also in that same group that our back swimmers are a part of. They're related to aphids and wheel bugs and things like that. They handle their life in a very, very interesting way. Water striders do not dive under the water. They skate on the surface of it. They're able to use their long legs to stand on top of the surface tension of the water because they weigh so little they can't penetrate the surface of the water. Their legs are covered in hydrophobic hairs to be able to allow them to stay on top of the water. And what they'll do is they'll just skate over to anything that's unlucky enough to fall on the water's surface, and that'll become their food. So they're opportunistic predators. And they're part of a family called Gerridae. There's also another one that's a little bit related to them called Velidae as well. You may hear some entomologists or specialists in that field workers in pond environments talk about those two. But the two of them are going to be doing essentially the same thing. It's just important to keep in mind, like I say here, they're able to move across the surface of the water without breaking the air-water interface. So that keeps them floating above it, and they just move along that. So one group that is another great indicator for your pond health is going to be an order called Odonata. And this is our order that is made entirely up of dragonflies and damselflies. These are very important predators in the water. They're able to act as ambush predators and maybe a little bit of wandering predation. And they also require very, very clean water. So in the case of our dragonflies here, the larger members of this group, we've all seen plenty of dragonflies before, and this one's no exception. It's got the 4 wings, the unique body structure, the legs that kind of form a cage for them to grab their prey. And this is the cocoon left behind when the adult has molted out of its larval stage. This is what the larva will look like. They are entirely aquatic. They have gill surfaces within their rectum, which is also where they take in water to move themselves. So think of them like kind of like a jet ski. And they are predatory. Their mouth parts are rather unique. What it is that their mouth parts form a kind of elbow joint, so they can shoot their lower jaw called a mentum out to grab their prey and bring them in where they can eat them. You're actually seeing the front part of those mouth parts right now. Damselflies are very, very similar to dragonflies. They're not nearly as large. Their wings are actually held in a different way over their back, and they're much smaller. And we have plenty of them here in Indiana. I'm sure you've seen them before. And then their larvae are going to look like this. This is a wandering predator who's got the large fins on the end of the abdomen. Those 3 large leaf-bladed kind of looking things are their gills that are going to be taking in oxygen for them. And they will just move around plants and the bottoms of the water and maybe do a little bit of hanging out to see if they can grab prey as they go. And their jaws also are this extensible elbow joint where they can grab prey and draw it in to consume. So one of the interesting things about Odonata, just a few facts, they are one of the most ancient insect groups that we study. I'm sure you've seen plenty of things before, fossils talking about insects with 6-foot wingspans. This is our Odonata. This is the one that we are referring to. They don't get nearly as large now, thankfully. They are just still with us. They are entirely predatory, and the adults definitely feed. They are aerial predators that stick near water sources. And they have this unique morphology, this ancient morphology that's not really shared by many other insects. Okay, just a couple more groups of organisms. These aren't necessarily macroinvertebrates, but I like to at least talk about them. So one of them are frogs and salamanders. So I didn't leave much salamander information in here at all. But frogs also form a very important bioindicating group. A lot of our frogs rely on ephemeral water sources to be able to do their reproduction, or many of them also just rely on ponds that last for a long time. What'll happen is the frogs will lay their eggs in the water and the tadpoles will hatch out, and they're going to act as either some form of bottom feeder or plant feeder. And in a few rare instances, there are species that will be predatory, though I don't think we have any of those in the continental United States. These tadpoles are going to form important parts of the food chain. They will be food for fish, for insects, many other things. And eventually they themselves are going to become predators that are going to have a large life around ponds and other environments. For the last several weeks, we have been hearing tree frogs do their mating calls. So they're getting ready to lay their first bunch of eggs in the water wherever you're living right now. And their life cycle is just kind of arranged around those, especially if they have an ephemeral pond they use. They will make sure that they get their eggs laid and the eggs hatch out before July gets here, because by that point, those water sources will have dried up for the season. And of course, they're going to be that major source of food for other organisms. Salamanders are going to have a very similar lifestyle. They will have larvae that will be aquatic. They'll have fins that, or not fins, gills along the back of their head. If you think of the axolotl, that is a type of salamander that's actually remained neotenous, where it's retained its immature characteristics. Some salamander species can keep their immature characteristics for an extended period of time until they feel like the time is right where they can become an adult. And then they too will leave the water just like frogs will, But in the case of salamanders, they're less mobile. They're going to go find like a nice wet cave or rocks they can live under, and then they'll just eat bugs and other things, kind of like our frogs do. And then one last one I wanted to touch on are our crayfish. We have a few crayfish here in Indiana. Most of them are in the southern portion of the state. Crayfish are crustaceans. They are very similar to lobsters and similar crustaceans. They will just look like miniature lobsters if you see them. They are very omnivorous. They're able to consume fish, plants, and other decaying material. And depending on where you live in the United States, you may see them as a great food source. Here in Indiana, we often see them when they're in their soft-shelled state as a great bait for fish. Unfortunately, this has led to a few problems. The rusty crayfish is a native of Indiana. However, many states consider them invasive because people keep using them as bait, and then they travel beyond the bounds of their normal environments. You can tell rusty crayfish from other ones because of that bright red patch you see on its kind of shoulder area behind its claws. So it's a native to the Ohio River Basin, of which we are a part, at least a portion of southern Indiana. But the rusty crayfish is now spread to 20 states. This crayfish is capable of outcompeting many of our native ones, and they clip down important vegetation. So they're actually removing habitat for fish and insects and other organisms. Now, like I said, they spread because of, well, human activity. We use them as live bait and they get away. And that's how they continue to spread. And unfortunately, there is no good way of eliminating rusty crayfish without killing the native crayfish and other organisms in that area. So that means that the best way we control them is being responsible about not using them as live bait. All right, with that, that is all I had for you this evening. I've got my contact information up here, the numbers for both my offices, and a few helpful links to our Purdue Ed Store and our Purdue Plant and Pest Diagnostic Lab. I want to thank you guys for coming tonight. You have been a great audience.